Nestled deep within the heart of a vast, ancient forest, there existed a village that time had long forgotten. Ravenscar was its name, though it was more of a whispered legend than a place anyone dared to speak of aloud. It was said that those who ventured into Ravenscar never returned, their names lost to the wind, their faces fading from the memories of those who knew them. The village was cursed, haunted by an unspeakable evil that had festered there for centuries. The story began long ago with the arrival of a mysterious figure who called herself Lady Seraphina. She came to Ravenscar on a moonless night, clad in a cloak as black as the abyss. No one knew where she came from or why she had chosen to settle in the village. From the moment she arrived, strange things began to happen. The villagers, once a cheerful and tight-knit community, grew wary and suspicious. Shadows seemed to move on their own. Whispers echoed in the night, and an unshakable feeling of dread settled over the village like a heavy fog. Livestock began to die in the fields, their bodies twisted and broken as if by some unseen force. Children would wake in the middle of the night, screaming of nightmares filled with fire and blood. And always, in the distance, the sound of crows cawing could be heard, even when there were none to be seen. Lady Seraphina never mingled with the villagers. She lived alone in an old, crumbling mansion at the edge of the village, a place that had long been abandoned before her arrival. The mansion was a place of nightmares, its windows dark and empty, its walls covered in ivy that seemed to writhe and pulse like living flesh. The villagers avoided it at all costs, but they could not escape the feeling that they were being watched, that something within those walls was always aware of their presence. One by one, the villagers began to disappear. It started with the elderly, those who lived alone or on the outskirts of the village. They would vanish without a trace, their homes left undisturbed, their belongings untouched. Then it was the children. They would be found in the morning, their beds empty, the sheets cold. The parents would search frantically, but there was never any sign of a struggle, no footprints, no clues as to where they had gone. The villagers were terrified, but they were also proud and stubborn. They refused to leave their homes, to abandon the land that had been in their families for generations. Instead, they turned to the church, seeking solace in prayer and the hope that their faith would protect them from whatever darkness had taken root in Ravenscar. But the church offered no sanctuary. One night, as the villagers gathered for evening mass, the doors of the church slammed shut on their own, trapping them inside. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the church into darkness. The only light came from the stained glass windows, but instead of the usual images of saints and angels, the glass now depicted scenes of horror, demons torturing the damned, rivers of blood, and endless fields of fire. The villagers screamed in terror, pounding on the doors, but they would not budge. Then the chanting began. It was a low, guttural sound coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The villagers fell to their knees, praying desperately. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, until it drowned out their voices. And then, silence. When the doors of the church finally opened, the villagers were gone. All that remained were their clothes, neatly folded and placed in the pews, as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Ravenscar was empty now, a ghost village, its streets silent and abandoned. The only sound was the cawing of crows, circling overhead like vultures. The few people who dared to pass through the forest spoke of a terrible stench that hung over the village, a smell of decay and death that made their skin crawl. Years passed, and Ravenscar faded into legend, a tale told to frighten children on dark, stormy nights. But the truth of what happened in that cursed village was far more terrifying than any story. For Lady Seraphina still lived, trapped within the walls of her mansion, her body twisted and contorted, her soul bound to the darkness that had consumed the village. She had sought power, immortality, and in her hubris, she had made a pact with something far older and more malevolent than she could ever have imagined. The entity she had summoned was not of this world. It was a being of pure darkness, a void that devoured everything it touched. It had promised her eternal life, but it was a life of endless torment, prison of her own making. She could not leave the mansion, could not die, could not escape the whispers that filled her mind, driving her to the brink of madness. And so she waited, alone in the dark, Her only company, the spirits of the villagers she had damned. They wandered the halls of the mansion, their faces twisted in agony, their voices rising in a chorus of despair. They blamed her for their suffering, cursed her name with every breath, but they could not harm her. She was beyond their reach, just as they were beyond salvation. But the entity was not content with Ravenscar alone. It was hungry, always hungry, and it needed more souls to feed on. It sent out its whispers, calling to those who were lost, those who were desperate, those who were willing to do anything to escape the pain of their lives. And so, over the years, others came to Ravenscar. They were drawn by the promise of power, riches, freedom from the suffering of the mortal world. They came from far and wide, seeking the mansion, seeking the darkness that dwelled within. But they all met the same fate. The moment they set foot in Ravenscar, they were trapped, their souls ensnared by the entity's power. They were consumed, body and mind, until nothing remained but empty shells, walking the streets of the village, their eyes hollow, their minds filled with nothing but the whispers. Ravenscar had become a prison, a place of eternal torment where the souls of the damned wandered endlessly, their only solace the knowledge that they would never be alone in their suffering. But the entity was not yet satisfied. It wanted more, always more, and so it waited, biding its time, sending out its whispers to the far corners of the earth. It knew that there would always be those who were drawn to the darkness, who were willing to sacrifice everything for the promise of power. And so, the legend of Ravenscar lived on, a tale told in hushed tones, a warning to those who would seek to challenge the darkness. But the whispers continued, growing stronger with each passing year, calling out to those who would listen, drawing them ever closer to the heart of the forest, to the place where the eternal night reigned, and the crows circled endlessly overhead. One cold winter's night, many years after Ravenscar had been forgotten by all but the most learned scholars of the occult, a young woman named Eleanor arrived in the village. She was a historian, obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the legends. She had spent years researching Ravenscar, gathering every scrap of information she could find, and now she had come to see it for herself. Eleanor was not like the others who had come before her. She did not seek power or riches. She sought knowledge, the truth behind the dark history of Ravenscar. She was determined to uncover the secrets of the village, to bring them to light, no matter the cost. As she walked through the deserted streets, she felt the weight of the centuries pressing down on her. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional caw of crow. But Eleanor was not afraid. She had come prepared, armed with ancient texts and protective charms. She believed that she could face whatever darkness lurked within Ravenscar and emerge unscathed. She made her way to the mansion at the edge of the village, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The mansion loomed before her, towering structure of blackened stone, its windows dark and empty. The ivy that covered its walls seemed to pulse and writhe as if it were alive. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, but then she steeled herself and pushed open the doors. They creaked on their hinges, and a blast of cold air hit her as she stepped inside. The interior of the mansion was as dark and foreboding as she had imagined. The walls were lined with decaying tapestries, the floors covered in dust. But she could feel the presence of something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting for her. She made her way through the mansion, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whispers began almost immediately, low and indistinct at first, but growing louder with each step she took. Eleanor ignored them, focusing on her goal. She had come to find the source of the darkness, confront it, and if possible, banish it. Finally, she reached the heart of the mansion, a large circular room with a domed ceiling. In the center of the room stood an altar, and above it hung a large, decaying portrait of a woman, Lady Seraphina. The eyes of the portrait seemed to follow Eleanor as she approached the altar. On the altar lay an ancient book, its pages yellowed with age. Eleanor recognized it immediately. It was the Grimoire of Ravenscar, the book that Lady Seraphina had used to summon the entity. She reached out to touch it, but as her fingers brushed the cover, the whispers stopped abruptly, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of malevolence. Eleanor looked up and saw, to her horror, that the portrait of Lady Seraphina was moving. The woman's face twisted into a grotesque smile, and the eyes, once mere paint on canvas, glowed with a sickly yellow light. "You should not have come here," voice whispered, though it did not come from the painting. It echoed all around her, a chorus of voices, each one dripping with malice. Eleanor backed away from the altar, her heart pounding. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, pressing down on her like a physical weight. But she could not leave now, not when she was so close to the truth. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. "I am the beginning and the end," the voice replied. "I am the darkness that consumes all. You have come seeking knowledge, but all you will find here is despair." Eleanor's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for her matches, her hands shaking, but before she could strike one, a cold hand gripped her wrist, freezing her to the bone. She screamed and tried to pull away, but the hand held her fast. She could feel the life draining out of her, her strength fading with each passing moment. And then in the darkness, she saw them. The spirits of the villagers, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes filled with sorrow and rage. "Help me," Eleanor gasped, but they only stared at her with empty, accusing eyes. "You are one of us now," the voices whispered. "Welcome to Ravenscar." And with that, the darkness swallowed her whole. Eleanor was never seen again. Her notes and equipment were found abandoned in the forest, but of her, there was no trace. Ravenscar remained a place of legend, a dark spot on the map where no one dared to venture. But the whispers continued, calling out to those who were lost, those who sought the darkness, drawing them ever closer to the Eternal Night of Ravenscar, where the crows circled endlessly overhead, and the souls of the damned waited for new companions in their endless torment.